Thanks so much for joining us today on this Thursday. I see some new faces and names, so I'm going to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Rachel Lieblein-Gerbala, and I'm the Programs Manager at the Spencer Educational Foundation. For those of you who may be less familiar with Spencer, we are dedicated to funding and supporting the education of tomorrow's risk management and insurance leaders. And we are so excited to welcome you today for our Spencer webinar on enterprise risk management, an enabler of business success, with Donna Gaylor, our presenter today. You are in excellent hands. Donna is quite the expert on this topic, and I'll tell you a little bit more about her before I hand the floor over. So Donna is a co-author of 3 books on enterprise risk management with co-author Al Decker, who may be joining us today as well, we'll see. And currently she serves as the senior advisor at Hanover Stone Solutions. Prior to that, Donna spent about 17 years, I think you said, with Zurich, and as her last position was as executive vice president and chief administrative officer for Zurich's worldwide general insurance business. And Donna is a longtime supporter and advocate of Spencer. She served as the chairperson of the Spencer Educational Foundation's board from 2006 to 2010. So we are so grateful to have Donna joining us today and for her to share her massive expertise with you all. She is more than happy to answer questions at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to write those questions into the chat and send them out, and I will field those to Donna at the end. And with that, Donna, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I appreciate it. So we'll go to the first slide. We'll start off right away. I'm very pleased to be able to do this webinar for Spencer. You know, ERM is not something new. It was new 20 years ago. And you know, at that time, people in the risk management and insurance arena were saying, ERM, what the heck is that? But today, it's certainly much more well known. It's not so enigmatic or foreign. And so, despite that, I want to start today with the basics. We'll cover some of the basics, and then we'll focus on strategic ERM. Because strategic ERM is really what sets ERM apart from older forms of risk management. And it's also what makes ERM so potent in terms of being able to deliver value to the organization. So with that, one of the basics is, what's the definition? Well, enterprise risk management is a process. It's a process by which organizations identify, measure, mitigate, and then monitor those risks and monitor the mitigation against those risks for the purpose of meeting business objectives and strategic goals and increasing shareholder value. It looks holistically across the entire organization, and it looks at risks including strategic, financial, operational, and many other categories of risk. And very importantly, it finds correlated risks which need special attention. So what do I mean by correlated risks? Let me give you a couple of examples. So for example, if a company has some ties with Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia has a major natural catastrophe, and of course this has happened in the past, right? So a correlated risk is when one event can simultaneously create a number of different risks for the organization. So with something like a natural catastrophe in Southeast Asia, a company could be affected in terms of its supply chain, not getting its raw material or its processed, its finished products. It may lose revenue because the supply chain now has a revenue risk because the supply chain has been damaged. And it may have customers in Southeast Asia who aren't buying because of the natural catastrophe. And it may also even have an operational risk because it may have some call centers in Southeast Asia. So, you know, one event can create supply chain risk, revenue risk, as well as operational risk. Another example that many companies have faced is counterparty related kinds of risks. For example, let's say a company has a relationship with a particular bank, and that bank goes belly up. It goes into bankruptcy. Well, maybe the company had a line of credit with that risk, so the line of credit now has to be replaced somewhere. Maybe the company also had their bank accounts there and issued paychecks through that bank. So now they have to find somebody else operationally who can do that for them. Maybe the bank was an investor in that company, so now they have to replace one of their investors, and they're experiencing some stock volatility, or share price volatility, I should say. And maybe somebody from the bank was even on the board of that company, and so having somebody from that bank on the company board, somebody from a bankrupt organization, could even create reputational risk for the company. So one event, the bankruptcy of a bank, if it was a counterparty to that company, could create a whole lot of different risks, operational, financial, even reputational. So ERM, because it's looking at risk so holistically, it's going to uncover all kinds of risks, and especially correlated risks. So what are the objectives of doing ERM? Well, first, obviously, to reduce a company's risk to achieving its strategy and its objectives. It's also has an objective of reducing the company's volatility in terms of its financial results. And it has an objective to enrich an organization's ability to do sound decision making. And finally, it has as an objective to enhance the company's reputation as a well-managed enterprise. So you can see that ERM is, it's not just buying insurance, it's not having a business continuity plan, it's not safety, it's all of those things plus everything I've just talked about. So we'll go to the next slide. So some of you who are listening today may have in the back of your head an objective to become a CRO. Maybe some of you are a CRO already, I don't know. But if becoming the CRO of a company is in your career sights, I wanted to share with you an illustrative job description. So what are the duties and responsibilities of somebody who has the Chief Risk Officer title for an organization? Well, they need to develop the ERM framework that the company is going to use. And that framework, they may have to develop it, or maybe they'll inherit one. They need to be able to put together a management level risk committee that is going to work with them to uncover risks, to draft the risk appetite and tolerance statements for the company. They need to be able to bring risk-related insight to decision-making that's going on in the senior levels of the organization. And actually run the entire process from soup to nuts in terms of the ERM process, which we'll look at in a second. They maintain the risk register, they input on strategy, they make sure that the whole company, that there's a culture, a risk-aware culture in the organization. They prepare a lot of presentations, like it or not, whether those presentations are for the board or for external stakeholders like rating agencies or regulators or investors. So there are a lot of facets going into what the duties and responsibilities are, but in addition to those, there's going to be a need to have a lot of unique and broad-based skills and knowledge. So we'll go to the next slide. I'm not going to read all of these because there's just too many, but if you take a look at the RIMS's risk management professional core competency, which you can go to the RIMS website and see also, there are a number of categories of skill and knowledge that CROs need to have. On this slide alone, you can see that there are core competencies that include communication skills, collaboration skills. There are attributes that are necessary, like being able to be a visionary, an innovator, being a facilitator, organizational knowledge that needs to be had, and business knowledge. This is a key one, business knowledge. If the chief risk officer can't really understand the business model that they're working within, if they don't know a little bit about the economics of that business, if they don't know something about all the functional areas within that organization, they will be at a disadvantage. We'll go to the next slide. A few more categories of skill and knowledge. Risk management knowledge, technical skills that need to be had, management skills, and subspecialties. So I want to focus, because we're going to be talking about strategic ERM in a second, on those management skills. The CRO needs to have a strategic perspective, needs to be able to plan, organize, make decisions, and develop relationships. But above all, have that strategic perspective. It's not just about today's risks, it's about the emerging risks as well. So we'll go to the next slide. I want to spend a second talking about ERM as part of the whole GRC complex. GRC standing, of course, for governance, risk, and compliance. So what is the difference between these three disciplines, and how do they interrelate? Well, they do interrelate for sure, because there needs to be collaboration between these three functions. What is governance? Governance is all about how well a company is managed, starting with, does the board provide sound oversight for the company? Is there a decision-making hierarchy that's established for the company so people know what their authority levels are? Are both the decision-making tree and these authority levels documented? Is there a strategy for the company, and is the strategy documented? So these are the kinds of things that go into making what is governance with a capital G. ERM, well, we're going to be talking more about that today, but we understand ERM is all about managing risk, right? And finding, not only managing risk, but trying to create opportunity out of those risks. Compliance is all about making sure that the company complies with its own policies and procedures, as well as making sure it complies with laws and regulations and accounting standards and that sort of thing. So together they serve to protect the organization and to make sure the organization is well run. I could add another component there, which is internal audit. Internal audit kind of makes sure that all of these three functions, as well as all the other functions in an organization, are doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? So internal audit is the second line of defense to make sure that the organization is actually doing or practicing what it's supposed to be practicing. So that just a little bit of context for you. We're going to go to the next slide, which also provides some context. So what is the ERM framework? You've probably heard that, that term. And there are some very standardized frameworks out there. There's a COSO framework. There's a ISO 31000, ISO 31010. But most companies today kind of create their own framework. They may choose one of those standard frameworks to model their framework around, but they kind of create their own framework. And a framework has to have some of the components that you see on this slide. Everything starts with the corporate strategy. That is the guiding force behind trying to make sure that the risks that the company faces don't negatively impact the corporate strategy. Then there needs to be, who is responsible for the ERM process in the company, and who does that person report to? Helping support the CRO and the process are the ERM committee, management level ERM committee, comprised of people from senior people from all of the functions or many of the functions in the organization that come together monthly or whenever is deemed appropriate to help the CRO identify risks, advocate on behalf of certain risk management measures. They're often the risk owners of certain risks, and they are the implementers of the mitigation plans. Another support for the CRO is the process itself, the ERM process. How do you identify, prioritize, quantify, prioritize, and monitor risks, and mitigate them? Another support, of course, is the risk culture in the organization, and we'll be talking about that in one of the examples later on. And then there's the ERM mandate, the mandate that has been set by the board and the CRO, the CEO, that this organization will have a robust ERM process. Beneath that come the risk appetite statements, the risk register that records all of the risks, the mitigation plans that are going to be in place to reduce the risks or eliminate the risks, and the board package. And of course, again, just to reiterate, we're talking about all kinds of risks. There's no kind of risk that's off limits. So we'll go to the next slide. The ERM process, again, it's to identify, quantify, prioritize, mitigate, and then monitor the risk and the mitigation plans and report on them to management, so everybody is abreast, stays abreast of how are these risks being managed. So we'll go to the next slide. So how does ERM ensure the success of the company? Well, by identifying the risks, it does allow the company to mitigate them or to create an opportunity from them. When you mitigate a risk, you avoid the risk, you transfer it, you reduce it, you eliminate it, all to reduce loss or volatility in the organization. And when you create an opportunity out of a risk, you're usually doing something to create a new product, a new service, a new way of doing things, which mitigates the risk, but which also enhances the organization's ability to increase its revenue or its success. So we're going to now look at some specific examples of how companies did or didn't mitigate their risks, or did or didn't create opportunities. So we'll go to the next slide, and the first one is Blockbuster. Some of you may or may not remember Blockbuster. It was a chain of stores. It was a chain that sold videos. You could go in, pick from hundreds of videos on their shelves. They were a national brand, and you could rent that video for a certain period of time. So, you know, people loved it at first. It was fun to go into a store with all those videos and be able to pick ones off the shelf. But, you know, people kind of got tired of driving to the store to get it, driving back to the store to return it. And often people were late when they returned their videos, and they were subject to significant late fees when they did that. So Blockbuster seemed oblivious to what might be going on around them. The question was, you know, who was looking at the risk? Who was looking at risks? Was there a CRO who was talking to marketing and asking questions about customer risk? You know, how are our customers feeling? What kind of customer complaints are we seeing? What are customers saying on social media, whatever social media was existing at that time? And there was some, for sure. Was the CRO or someone asking about, well, you know, what risk is technology bringing? Are there other things that could come along that could make our business model of coming to the store obsolete. It didn't seem like any of that was happening. So along comes Netflix, recognizing what the risks were or the problems were with Blockbuster, and they created a mail ordering type of way to rent videos. Now, Blockbuster could easily have altered its model and gone the mail route. It didn't. And then they did try to change their late fee structure, but it was too little too late for most customers. Then Netflix not only went beyond the mail type of business model and started streaming when that technology was available. So they continually looked at what was the risk to them if they stayed with the status quo, and making those changes, making those innovations that allowed them to prosper. So again, Blockbuster could have been identifying the risks to their business model all along. They could have been the Netflix of today, but they're not. And so I'm not suggesting here, by the way, that the CRO needs to be the chief strategist for the company. What I am suggesting is that if the CRO is asking the right questions about where risks might be, whether it's customer risks, technology risks, if they're not looking at emerging risks, are there competitors that are coming out with different ways of doing it? If they're not looking at all of these risks, they're not able to help the organization focus on the strategic changes that need to be made. So hopefully at the end of this presentation, you'll have some questions about some of these examples, but I did want to kind of make clear that I'm not suggesting the CRO needs to be the strategist. I'm suggesting that they need to be asking risk-related questions that will help the organization think about their business model, their strategy, and addressing the risks to the business model and the strategy. We'll go to the next slide. Thank you. The next one I want to talk about is Wells Fargo. So Wells Fargo, of course, is a heavily regulated institution because it's a financial institution. I think most of you know some of this saga. It's paid a $3 billion fine in 2020 because of the fake accounts that it had established. And that settlement doesn't even include some other fines that it was hit with. One was a $1 billion fine because it was forcing customers to pay for car insurance that they didn't need and mortgage fees that they didn't owe. And an earlier fine of $185 million that was related to the fake accounts. They also had an asset cap placed on them. So, you know, their growth was stymied because of this asset cap that was placed on them. And very importantly, before COVID hit, you know, while other banks' share price was escalating, their share price was down 5%. So, you know, a lot of what they did had to do with an incentive program that had been put in place for cross-selling in the company. You know, you made a better incentive, a better bonus if you were selling or cross-selling more accounts. So if ERM had been practiced effectively, the program, this incentive program that gave rise to the unethical and fraudulent behavior should have been or would have been identified as a risk. Even after that behavior was rampant throughout the organization, you know, if there was really robust ERM, it would have been identified that there's a risk here in pursuing this or in continuing this incentive program. And further, even after whistleblowers came out about all of this fraudulent behavior, Wells Fargo fired 8 there were 8 whistleblowers. They fired the 8 whistleblowers. Can you imagine? So no one in risk management was saying, wait a minute, there's a huge risk in firing a legitimate whistleblower. In fact, they just got fined another $7.8 million for discriminatory hiring. So their saga continues, even after all these fines that they've paid. Very importantly, what the takeaway I want to create here is to show you really the link and what was expected of the CRO. So what I would like to do now is take a moment to read to you a few of the things that occurred to the CRO once all of this was identified and brought to light. The CRO was investigated by the controller of the currency. He was fined $1.2 million himself personally. And the parts that I'm going to read to you are the actual findings of the Office of the Controller of the Currency. When I say the word respondent, translate that to CRO. Among other things, respondent was responsible for providing credible challenge to business leaders on activities that may lead to elevated risk, for ensuring proactive identification of emerging risk issues and their potential effect on the company's aggregate risk profile. By 2012, at the latest, respondent, CRO, should have known about the systemic sales practices misconduct problem at the community bank, its root cause, and the inadequate controls in place to prevent and detect such misconduct. From at least 2013, respondent, CRO, efforts were inadequate in advising the CEO and the board of directors that the community bank's business model posed a significant risk and incentivized illegal activity, that the relevant controls were deficient, and that the community bank was not resolving the problem. And the last thing I'll read is respondent, CRO, rated the community bank's management of sales practices as satisfactory in each memorandum and recommended no incentive compensation adjustments for the community bank's senior leadership related to sales practices until 2016, when he recommended minimal adjustments related to the sales practices. So, you know, when you are sitting in the CRO role, it is expected that you are looking for risks throughout the organization. And these human resource risks, which turned into serious fraud regulatory risks, should have been identified. And there's no doubt about it when you see that the former CRO was fined and found to be negligent. I'm going to stop there with this example. I do want to say that, many times the final results of some of these issues never get identified. People miss them. You read about this terrible misconduct and you read about the fines, but you never read about the behind the scenes. How many people had to be fired because of their behavior, how many people were actually fined on a personal level because of what they did. So I wanted to bring that to you. We'll go to the next slide. This next company is not extremely well known. They're not a brand name, well-known brand name in the US, but Serco is a global UK services company. They're huge. They have many customers in the US, including the US Army, Navy, state and local departments of transportation, the Pension Benefit Guarantee Fund. And so they do a lot of different kinds of consulting. They have published their group policy statement on risk management, and I've included it here on this slide. They believe that risk management does support Serco in achieving its strategic and business objectives. That's what we said right in the beginning as one of the objectives for ERM. And they further say it does this by maximizing opportunities and reducing the likelihood of business loss and effectively managing our exposure to risks. So Serco is looking at ERM as both finding opportunities as well as eliminating risks. So, so in this case, what was the opportunity that they had? We looked at Blockbuster and we said they had the opportunity to have become the next Netflix, but they didn't take that opportunity. Serco, on the other hand, took what happened to them and created an opportunity out of it. What happened to them was they were accused of fraud in their dealing with the U.S. Prison Authority. And the U.S. prohibited them from bidding on any new contracts for a period of time. So what did Serco do? Well, first thing they did was they fired a lot of the senior team that was responsible for allowing that fraud to occur. The second thing they did was they made a major change to their mission statement. They limited the number of types of services they would offer. They limited the types of things, the types of contracts they would pursue. And for any company, when you step back and you change your mission, that's changing your mission. When you change your mission, you change your strategy, that's a big deal. But they did it because they wanted to survive and they wanted to be successful. And as a result of those changes, they came back to the U.S. After their period of prohibition was over, they came back. This year, for example, they got a $57 million contract involving the U.S. Space Force, the new U.S. Space Force. Back in October 2019, they got a $32 million contract to provide psychological health services for the U.S. Navy. So they're back in business in the U.S. And so they turned that risk, and that issue into an opportunity. Let's take a look at the next slide. So this next one is again more in terms of looking at the risk and then finding a mitigation for it. You know, Wells Fargo
Donna, it looks like we lost your audio.
didn't find. Is it
Can you hear me?
back?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay.
Great.
Okay, so we're looking at Jet Propulsion Laboratory as an example of where a risk was well mitigated. The risk wasn't well mitigated in terms of Wells Fargo, but here it was. So the Jet Propulsion Laboratory is a division of the U.S. National Aeronautics and Space Administration. It embarks on really long and expensive projects to engineer new engines to be used in airborne types of vehicles. And obviously, it has to reduce the risk in its projects so that it doesn't produce something that ultimately doesn't work or doesn't work as well as it should, or the project becomes delayed or over budget. So, so recognizing that they had this risk, it's a real risk that any of those things could happen to one of their projects, they thought, how are we going to mitigate that risk? And what they did was they established a risk review board of independent technical experts. These are not people that are part of the U.S. Jet Propulsion Laboratory. They're external people. Their whole role is to come in and to challenge the engineers' designs and and work with, looking at how the project is going throughout the whole life cycle of that project. And it is said that there are meetings that are very confrontational. It can get confrontational when you're telling somebody who thinks they know what they're doing that something isn't going well or isn't quite right. But those meetings are also very constructive. And so that type of review, that type of mitigation has really saved the Jet Propulsion Laboratory a lot of time and a lot of money. It sorts out issues, it sorts out risks, it corrects the risk or mitigates the risk before it has time to really surface. So one of the reasons I mentioned this particular one is because I think it's an example of talking about, in real terms, risk culture. A lot of people have trouble understanding, what does risk culture mean? It's very nebulous, a little hard to define. But in this case, you can see at some level, the people who decided and the people who participate in this risk review board process had to have a seriousness about risk, had to feel a seriousness about risk, had to put aside a lot of doubts about how this might work, who might be alienated, this is a novel thing. Now, I'm not suggesting that your typical company is going to hire outside people to come in and do these kinds of risk reviews. Most companies are never going to do that, right? But at the very least, they need to do it internally. They need their own people to feel free enough to challenge things, to point out risks in such a way that those people aren't termed naysayers or people are afraid of change or any kind of negative term. That they recognize that when people call out risks, it's not because they're trying to hurt the project, they're trying to help the project, they're trying to avoid risk, they're trying to eliminate risk. So anyway, I just thought this was a good example of a company that kind of had their heads on straight when it comes to risk culture. So we'll go to the next slide. What are the characteristics of ERM that drive success for the organization? So essentially, some of this is repetition from the beginning, and the first thing is that it's holistic. That because ERM covers all functions, it prevents many different types of risks from being overlooked. In the past, certain kinds of risk were being watched pretty closely, but other kinds of risks, like maybe HR risk or reputation risk or cyber risk, weren't being watched the way they should have been. But with ERM, they really are. And the other thing is, because ERM looks at risk holistically, it does find those correlated risks. And that was another place where companies often overlooked those correlated risks because they only saw kind of the front, the major issue there. A natural catastrophe might cause some physical damage, and they weren't looking at some of the auxiliary risks or the follow-up risks that a natural catastrophe could have. The other reason why ERM can, or a characteristic that helps to drive success for the organization, is that it is strategic. It is strategic and operational, but the strategy is always the starting point. And in the past, risk managers weren't expected to be quite so strategic. And let's face it, one of the reasons it drives success is because strategic risks, if they are identified early enough, they can really save a company. Strategic risks are usually more existential than any other type, are a type of existential risk more so than any other type of risk. If your business model fails, the whole company fails. If the strategy fails, the whole company fails. If you get hit with a natural catastrophe at one of your plants, it could cost a lot of money, but it's not going to usually make the whole company fail. If if there's a fire someplace in the company, it's not going to make the whole company fail, generally speaking. So, but a strategic risk can make the whole company fail. So another characteristic of ERM that helps it drive success is that it is process-based. And the key thing here is that, a good process is dynamic, it's innovative, it's not ad hoc. So ERM does have process points that we've talked about earlier. And if those process points aren't followed, you won't have a successful ERM. But if they are followed, you have the roadmap to enable the company to really practice it well. And ERM is not a one-time, one and done kind of exercise. It is a continuous process. So those are characteristics that help ERM drive success for the whole organization. Let's go to the next slide. So ERM's value, many times staff areas, and the CRO, risk management, is considered a staff area. It's sometimes very hard to justify the value you bring to the organization, especially when that value is avoiding a loss. So how do you quantify the avoidance of a loss? Very, very difficult. But ERM brings value with or without that quantification. ERM does limit surprises for the organization. It minimizes risks and their effects. It helps a company recover quicker when a risk does occur and it hasn't been avoided. And finally, it helps the company be viewed more favorably by its stakeholders than a company that doesn't have ERM. And I do want to call attention to a couple of quantifiable studies that were made. The first one I want to mention was, well, both were done a while ago, but they're still very relevant. In 2016, Aon did a study on the effect of mature ERM process on share volatility. And they were able to report a strong statistical correlation between risk maturity and reduced share stock price volatility. So the more mature the ERM process was, the less volatility there was in the share price of the company. Another study that RIMS was involved in, that was done in 2015, found that organizations exhibiting mature risk management practices realized a valuation premium of 25%. So that means the value of that stock was 25 higher than similarly situated companies that didn't have ERM. So those are two studies that actually tried to do the quantification of the value that ERM brings. But again, on this slide, I've tried to talk a little bit about some of the less quantifiable, but still very, very important values that ERM brings to the organization. So that kind of brings us to the end. The next slide is just a slide of the book that I've written about with my co-author Al Decker on ERM, and I'm happy to entertain any questions that you may have. I may not be able to answer them all, but I'll certainly try to. Do we have any, Rachel?
Hi, everyone. Well, it doesn't look like anyone's written any in the chat. You're more than welcome to write them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and just ask them aloud now. Don't be shy. see. Give everyone a minute to process.
Sure, sure.
Donna, that was great and so thorough and illustrative.
Thank you. Oh, I think we have one coming in.
I hear
Hi,
somebody.
this is Dan. I have a question.
Go for it.
Donna, you had touched on internal audit when you were talking about governance, risk, and compliance, and their, I guess, interest in supporting enterprise risk management. I've seen in some organizations that don't either have a strong risk management program per se, but typically let's say the relationship with the insurance broker or the function either falls to, let's say, the chief financial officer or the general counsel. But whenever it comes to whether you would say the sponsor of enterprise risk management within an organization or the champion internally, obviously you would hope that, that figurehead at least is the chief executive officer, but knowing it's going to be somebody below that level, who do you think is best suited within their responsibilities and function to be that champion for sponsoring enterprise risk management and, shepherding it through implementation and management of it?
I mean, that's a great question because smaller to mid-sized companies often don't have a chief risk officer. So someone else has that as part of their role. And as you said, sometimes it's the chief legal officer or general counsel, sometimes it's the treasurer, sometimes it's the CFO. If the company has a COO, that's always a good one to use, but that's much more rare. I think that the CEO always has to be considered the top sponsor for ERM, regardless of who may have that as part of their job description. If there isn't a standalone CRO, I think the CEO always, hopefully, will be the sponsor. If not the CEO, then the CFO, because let's face it, the CFO has a lot of clout in the organization, and so I think if I had to have a second, a number two sponsor, it would be the CFO. I hope that answers the question.
Great. Alessio has a question he put in the chat. Could you please elaborate a bit more about risk culture?
Okay. Of course, Alessio, it is very, very important. And if risk culture doesn't permeate throughout the whole organization, you can have employees doing any number of things that are very, very risky, even knowingly doing things that are very, very risky. So what is risk culture? It's getting an appreciation of risk, of being risk aware and understanding also what the company's position is on risk. And the best way to do that, well, there's a few practices that really have to be in place in the organization. One, of course, there needs to be some top-down communication about the company's views on risk management and on taking risk. Just like the company has to have some communication about sexual harassment, or has to have communication about any number of things that they want to be sure that their employees have the right cultural response to. They need to have communication from the top down about ERM. In addition, risk owners throughout the organization have to make that message go down through their function that, we are managing XYZ risks, and that all risks are important and that you have a role to play in that risk. So that's less formal communication and more communication just through normal management channels, whether that's staff meetings, performance reviews, informal discussions, what have you. And when somebody takes a risk that is totally unacceptable, they need to be held accountable for it. They need to be held accountable for it. I'm not saying that their name has to be, put on on SharePoint and saying we just demoted so and so because they took an unacceptable risk. But that person, that individual, has to feel a consequence for having done that. One claim I was looking at not too long ago was somebody, it was a slip and fall at a casino. Some of the people who were deposed in that claim said that several employees of the casino knew the floor was wet, and there was a wet floor sign that was leaning against the wall, and not one of those casino employees picked that sign up and put it over the wet spot. That is like the worst example. The person hurt themselves. They didn't. It wasn't fatal, but so I don't want to over dramatize it. But you got to admit that's an awful, horrible example of not having a good risk culture. And I hope that every one of those employees were found out as to who they were, who passed up moving that wet floor sign where it should have been. I don't know, Alessio, does that help?
Yes, Donna, thank you. It's a very interesting topic. I hadn't heard about it much before, but thank you. That was very concise.
Okay, you're welcome. Any others?
Donna, this is Al. This is Al Decker. How you doing? Good, very good presentation. I agreed with everything you said, of course. The one thing I would like to say about risk culture is it's important, whoever the actual CRO is or whoever is running it, has to be somebody who is advising the company, not somebody who's accepting or signing off on the risk. The business owner has to sign off on the risk. When I was the chief risk officer at Electronic Data Systems for a number of years, and when I took the role, somebody said to me, "Oh boy, we finally have somebody to accept all our risk." And I said, no, that's not the case. It shouldn't be the chief risk officer who accepts the risk. It's the business unit owner that accepts the risk or doesn't accept the risk. If you have an organization where the chief risk officer is the one who's accepting the risk, you're going away from a corporate culture of risk management. In other words, you're allowing the organization to abdicate its responsibilities to one person in the organization, and that's not the correct way to go either. Risk is owned by the business unit. Risk is owned by the business manager. And ultimately, risk is owned by the chief executive of the company, which again, I'll reiterate, has to be someone who has absolute 100% buy-in to the program, respects it, honors it, gets reports from it on a regular basis, and is interested in it. If the CEO is not interested in it, little by little, no one else will be.
Excellent points. Yeah, I almost put in the illustrative CRO job description, does not own the risk. The CRO doesn't own the risk. They own the process, maybe you could say, of making sure that all those steps in the process are performed. They don't own the risk.
Absolutely.
Any other questions?
So kind of going back with what you were talking about with accepting the risk. So it would be the CRO's job to evaluate risk, but not to take ownership of the risk. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Ownership of the process, ownership of making sure that the process is really followed, and and risks are being monitored and those mitigation plans are being monitored, but they don't own the risk.
Great. Well, if there's any more questions, please feel free to unmute yourself now. Or again, you can write that in the chat if you'd prefer. All right. Well, Donna, thank you so much for that incredible presentation. I want to just on behalf of everyone at the Spencer Education Foundation and everyone on the line today, thank you for taking your time to be with us and share your wealth of knowledge on the topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you for letting me.
Of course, we are so happy to have you. And for everyone on the line, thanks for joining us on this Thursday. I know for some of you, you're current students and have just started your new semester, so I hope all of that is going well and off to a smooth start, or will be off to a smooth start next week or in the future. Looks like somebody's just posted something in the chat. Oh, Kyle said thank you, Donna. So thanks for being with us. I have one quick announcement on the Spencer front. We have another upcoming webinar on Wednesday, September 9th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. That webinar is titled The Global and U.S. Economic Outlook and What It Means for My Career. It's going to be presented by 3 panelists from Zurich. The first, Ron Davis, who's Executive Vice President and Global Head of Customer Management. Then we have Guy Miller, who's Chief Market Strategist and Head of Macroeconomics. So he's going to be talking about from the macroeconomic lens, what's going on in the global and U.S. economic outlook. So we're excited about that. And then finally, Jessica Aguilar will be joining us, who is the Vice President and Head of Talent Acquisition for Zurich North America. So it's going to be an interesting blend of speakers, and we hope to see you on September 9th. And with that, everyone have a great rest of your day. Thanks for being with us. And Donna, thank you once again.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Rachel.
Most welcome.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everyone. Thanks.
Bye-bye.